to our channel. If you're new here, hi, my name is Anshula, and today we're going to be talking about the best books of 2021. These are books that I personally read in 2021. They're not books that necessarily came out this year, but they are ones that I absolutely loved. I find so much comfort in stories. Reading others' narratives has really helped me shape my own, and these are books that have changed me, have influenced me, and just been such a big part of my life this year. This is almost like a thank you note to the books that I have read this year. And there are so many more books that I absolutely loved this year, but in order to cut this down to just 10, what I have done is I have created little categories and I'll pop them up on the screen for you. So without further ado, let's jump into the best books that I read in 2021. So the first category that I want to talk about is literary fiction, and there was one book this year that I just knew when I read it was going to be my favorite literary fiction book of the year, and it was, and that was In Chinatown by Charles Yu. This book follows our main character, Willis Wu, who is a bit player in a production called Black and White, and he is just a generic Asian man, but he dreams of being the kung fu guy. Usually I love character-driven books. I love books with very complicated characters, very complex characters, and this book had some very flat characters. I think flat characters work so well for this book because it was a satire. This is a satire about Asian American representation in Hollywood. I think Wu's journey in this book poses a lot of questions, and there are a lot of great discussions. I just really enjoyed seeing the author's thoughts on this, and I enjoyed seeing how they came across. I know that the author, Charles Yu, is a screenplay writer, and this follows some bits of screenplay formatting in terms of the Courier New font, how dialogue is structured in this book. It's not fully a screenplay though. It does have very traditional storytelling elements that you would expect as well, and at times it can be very poetic. So it rides this line in between these different formats. I just really loved that it wasn't really anything, it was its own thing, and I think that the idea of this book having its own identity just made it even more impactful for me. My brain was trying to box it into a specific genre, and I just couldn't, and I just really loved that. The next book that I want to talk about is a short story collection by Mariana Enriquez. It was called Things We Lost in the Fire, and it was translated to English by Megan McDowell. I absolutely loved this book so much. I own a lot of short story collections. I don't read them all the way through. I kind of pick and choose which short stories I want to read when I'm in the mood to read them, but I read this book front to back. It was so good. It is a horror book, and at times it's really gory and graphic. That is not the kind of thing that I like. I don't like gory books. I don't like really graphic details in books. The social commentary and the messages that the author was trying to get across horrified me way more, gave me way more nightmares than any of the descriptions in the book, any of the fantastical elements of this book. And I just really enjoyed that because I felt like that just showed her talent as a storyteller to be able to get that across. I think that the things that are way more horrifying that she discusses in terms of inequality, patriarchy, corruption, all of those things are the parts of this book that will leave you feeling so much more unsettled than the actual horror descriptions. And I just, this is such a good book. I can't recommend it enough. The best classic that I read was Letters to a Young Poet by Rilke. This is a collection of letters from Rilke to a young budding poet. This was the kind of book that I wanted to go in annotating because I do tend to annotate a lot of the classics that I read, but I knew after a couple pages in that annotations were just not going to work for this book because I wanted to underline all of the sentences. I wanted to tab all of the pages. Rilke offers so much sage wisdom and advice, and there's definitely a lot of maturity in his letters and how he provides commentary to Capus. Capus is who he is writing the letters to. There's a lot of talk about solitude and art and creativity, and I just feel like if you are a creative, if you're a writer or an artist, this is a book that will be so meaningful to you. And even if you're not, the discussions on solitude are just so impactful. I felt so much while reading this, and this is the kind of book that you should read with your heart and not with your head. It's almost like every sentence was a takeaway, every sentence was a life lesson, every sentence was something that I could sit and ponder and just spend a lot of time with. This book meant a lot to me this year, and if you're looking for a classic to read, I do highly recommend this. So that is Letters to a young poet by Rilke. So moving on to the category of poetry, the best poetry book that I read this year was Multiple Choice by Alejandro Zambra. This was such a unique book. This book is set in the format of a multiple choice test, and I know I'm not selling it when I say that, but trust me, this is a test that you will really want to take. It is styled in the format of the Chilean aptitude test, which I think was administered between 1963 to 2003. Those dates might be wrong. I'll pop up the correct dates on the screen. And the author took this test in 1993, and it was styled in the portion of the verbal exam that he took, and I think that this test was meant to be kind of like an SAT. The brilliance of this book is the fact that you can read it multiple times. I think poetry, for me personally, is something that is meant to be read over and over again, and you can pluck out new meanings from it each time. This was structured in a way where it was really easy to do that, and you can tell there was so much thought that was put into this book. A few of the questions at the start of the book are very easy, and it kind of leads you on thinking that this book is not going to have any substance or any meaning, and then as the questions get more and more difficult, you start to think and contemplate more. It kind of hit me how genius this book was when I read the sentence order portion of it, because in the options you get a chance to view different arrangements of the sentences and you pick the correct one. Wow, was it beautiful to read the poems in so many different ways, and to see that the poems had different meanings depending on how you arrange the sentences, and to think that as a poet he structured it as such. I really love that. I also really love the sentence elimination, because some of them I was like, do I have to eliminate everything? I really love every sentence. Or some of them I was just like, oh, but I don't want to eliminate that. And you get to see the different meanings depending on the sentence you eliminate as well. And so it was just really fun, interactive piece of poetry that I got to read. It felt like you were there with the artist. So clever. It was so genius. I've never read anything like it before. I think I was struck by the novelty of it, but also by the execution as well. I read a lot of amazing memoirs this year, but there was one that I read recently that I just knew I had to talk about. And I listened to this book on audiobook. That is Crying in H-Mart by Michelle Zauner. Michelle Zauner is a singer and a guitarist in the band Japanese Breakfast. I really loved reading this book. This book is so stripped down. It is so raw. It is so emotional. It's an exploration of grief. Zauner comes back to become a quasi-caregiver for her mother. Her mother has cancer, and she is sort of enveloped in grief. There are certain emotions that can happen in conjunction with grief, and they might not seem like pretty combinations, but they are valid combinations, and I felt like she described those, whether it was feeling sort of selfish or jealous. I feel like the audiobook does a really good job with the pacing as well, and its kind of slowness, and the audiobook is narrated by the author. I feel like that always adds an extra dimension to the storytelling element of it. This is definitely the kind of book that you read with a box of tissues to the side. It is not sad all the way through. There are moments that make you feel happy for Zauner. One of the moments that I recall is the part where she gets to sort of plan her wedding with her mother. I thought it was so incredibly sweet. It's a book that leaves you feeling that Michelle Zauner is an incredibly human person. It did feel like a book that was very real, and I felt like this book probably did more for the author than any reader. A lot of times the kind of art that's so deeply personal to people, they don't tend to publish it. To get a chance to see that kind of art, I'm just very, very grateful for that chance. Moving on to something a little more lighthearted, and that is the best graphic novel that I read this year, and that is The Tea Dragon Society by Kay O'Neill. I absolutely loved this book so much. It doesn't have a lot of plot, it doesn't have a lot of character development, but I just really, really enjoyed it. This is a story that follows Greta, and she becomes involved in the world of tea dragons, which are these adorably illustrated characters. The artwork in this book is absolutely sumptuous. It is so beautiful. It is stunning, and it reminds me of a Studio Ghibli film. It is something that I feel like I can almost walk into, and I really want it to be an animated movie. It's so cute and sweet. I love the colors that the artist chose for this. It felt very warm and comforting. I just really like the concept of tea dragons, and I think tea dragons should exist in the real world. Isn't this artwork just stunning and beautiful? It's the kind of book that makes me feel like I'm wrapped in a warm hug. The next book that I want to talk about is the best young adult book that I read this year, and that is Patron Saints of Nothing by Randy Rebai. This is a story that follows Jay, who is just planning on spending the last year of high school goofing off, playing video games, and it turns out that his cousin, June, is murdered, so he heads to the Philippines to dig deeper and find out what happened to June. There is an implication that June was killed during President Duterte's war on drugs, and Jay is going in to find out whether this is actually true and some of the deeper nuances of what happened to June. I really enjoy the character development in this book. I feel like Jay didn't transform into a completely different person by the end of the book, but his time in the Philippines had hammered his personality and sort of molded it into something that was slightly different but also a little bit realistic. By the end of this book, he doesn't still truly find out who he is, he just has more of a grip on who he is. And I think that's a beautiful kind of line to end it at. Another thing that I kind of enjoyed seeing, which was annoying for me as a reader, but by the end of the book I kind of got where the author was going with it, is Jay as a character is very judgy. He makes a lot of assumptions. I feel like this book explores the idea that a savior complex can originate from the society that we're staying in or how we're growing up, and he doesn't have all of the answers, but he thinks he does. I feel like that is a very teenage thing. I do think that when I was a teenager, I also felt like I had the answers to everything, and I didn't. But it is one of those books that drives that point home in a very beautiful way. I will say stick it out to the end because it feels like it's going in one direction, and the ending takes a little bit of a different turn. If you feel like you know what's gonna happen, you might not. I did enjoy seeing some of the struggles that Jay had and how that played into the story. He definitely had to deal with a lot of guilt, fear, the idea of imperfection, and I think those are very real struggles for a teenager, and it felt very real. I originally picked this one up thinking it was a fantasy novel because of the cover. It is not a fantasy novel, it is a contemporary, but it turned out to be one of my favorite books of the year. The very best general nonfiction that I read this year was You Look Like a Thing and I Love You by Janelle Shane. I absolutely love this book. The tagline for this is How Artificial Intelligence Works and Why It's Making the World a Weirder Place, and that is the most descriptive tagline for a book I've seen in a very long time. This book is about the limitations of AI, but it's presented in this very witty and funny and humorous way. Shane uses these amusingly absurd and wonderfully wacky examples to drive her point home, where you see everything from AI generated recipes to a neural net trying to write Harry Potter fanfiction, which I think was my favorite part of the book. This book is very beginner friendly. Don't be put off by the term AI. You don't need a computer science background. You don't need a data science background to read this. Janelle Shane explains everything from the very bare basics, and she kind of slowly progresses into more advanced concepts, but it's broken down in a very simple way to understand. I would really highly recommend this if you're a beginner. If you are familiar with machine learning and if you're familiar with artificial intelligence, you probably won't get anything new out of this book, but that being said, it's still really funny and I still really enjoyed it, and so I would still recommend it if you're looking for a good laugh. I wasn't expecting this book to be as comical as it was. Shane is a blog writer, so a lot of the chapters feel very blog style, which I loved. I mean, I'd be a hypocrite if I said I didn't like blog style writing, and so you do definitely get that sort of bloggery feel from it, but it just makes it a little more personal and more fun, and I just really enjoyed it. This is exactly what I wished my textbooks in university were like. So if you're looking for a more lighthearted nonfiction read that isn't too heavy with technical jargon but still provides a ton of information, I'd highly recommend this book. So the best fantasy that I read this year comes as no surprise, and that is The 13.5 Lives of Captain Bluebear. I absolutely love this book. It was just this wonderful, magical, whimsical journey that follows our main character, a Bluebear. A Bluebear has 27 lives, and in this tale he recounts 13.5 of them, and I just enjoyed everything from the illustrations to the story. I love that it was a partial satire, and it was just a great fantasy book. There's everything in this book from mini pirates to hobgoblins and a spider witch and all these wonderful fantastical creatures, and I think that a lot of this story also parallels real life and the real world, and so it's also in a way a coming of age story. This one is a standalone fantasy, but I just really enjoyed the wit and the humor in this, so I want to pick up more books by this author next year. I want to pick up City of Dreaming books next. I think that's the one you recommended. So this was hands down my favorite fantasy of the year. If you like fantasy, definitely recommend this one, especially if you're looking for a fantasy that's non-committal, because I think a lot of fantasies are a huge series and I'm definitely more of a standalone fantasy kind of person. It had everything that I was looking for in a fantasy. It was funny, it was adventurous, and it was very creative. The next book that I want to recommend is my favorite book of 2021, and that book is The Boy, the Mole, the Fox, and the Horse by Charlie Mackesy. It's the kind of book that you don't even need to read front to back. I do recommend reading it front to back once, and then afterwards it's the kind of book that you can just literally open up to any page and just have your heart warmed. And sometimes that's just something that I need. I think this book is also like the perfect gift. You can gift this to anybody. I think they will enjoy it. I don't have kids, but I think this would be a great book to read to kids. It does give me sort of the same warm fuzzy feelings as reading Winnie the Pooh. I really hope that one day this becomes a children's classic, because I feel like it definitely has all of the hallmarks of a children's classic. I'm not really sure how to express my feelings for this book, but I think that what it does best is it takes these concepts of kindness and love and friendship, and it breaks it down in a way that I just really loved. I just opened up to a random page and it says, "What is the bravest thing you've ever said?" asked the boy. "Help," said the horse. And it's just something so simple, yet has so much meaning and so much depth to it. And I think that's the part that gets me about this book every time. So that was just me gushing about all of my favorite books of 2021, and it was such a small sampling of books that I really loved this year, because I read so many books that I really, really loved. Let me know what your favorite books of the year were down in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching. Bye guys!